at them. So we're particularly looking at some of the homelessness challenges from the perspective of some of the challenges that local authorities are facing in dealing with migrant homelessness. So we have two presenters today who are going to give us their presentations on the issues. So we have Adis Sehic from the Work Rights Centre, who is going to talk to some research that they've been doing, particularly about the Ukrainian migration and the people from Ukraine who have come to the UK and settled here. And then we have Eve Barnsley from London Councils, who's going to talk about some of the work that she does with regard to supporting local authorities and helping them to deal with migrant homelessness and talking about some of the key challenges that she knows they face. After that, we should have an opportunity to have some discussion and to talk about some of the issues that we're seeing on the front line and perhaps ask some questions and think about some responses to some of that. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Adis now. So Laura has the slides up there, and if you
sorry.
Oh, there we go. Okay, and so should be able to move through the slides, hopefully. Yes, there we go.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Bethan and Practice for inviting me to speak. My name's Adis Sehic. I'm a Policy and Research Officer at the Work Rights Centre. I joined the organisation quite recently, actually. I was previously working as an immigration solicitor at a firm in London. So yeah, we're kind of talking about the issues regarding Ukrainian arrivals to the UK. But first, yeah, I just kind of briefly wanted to speak about us as an organisation. So we're a charity that's run by migrants, and kind of we help the migrant community access employment justice, improve their social mobility, and regularise their immigration status. We have kind of advice clinics in London and Manchester, where we provide advice on a variety of different areas, including employment, immigration, social security. Our advisors tend to deal with around 20 different beneficiaries a week on a range of different issues. And just to give you an indication, I think it's a few more bullet points. We've had around, I think the exact figure is 462 Ukrainian kind of queries to our service users over the year, which, to give you an indication of where that sits with the advice that we give to the rest of our service users, that's about a third of the entire population that we've helped throughout the year. We've helped over 4,000 people since 2016 and helped recover about £170,000 in unpaid wages and fees. Importantly, we are not a homelessness charity specifically, but it is one of the issues that affects our service users regularly. It interlinks with a number of different issues that we help our clients with, and we try to deal with those needs holistically. So I've tried to cater the presentation towards homelessness, but where necessary, I'll touch on some other factors as well. Yeah, I think there are 4 bullet points on this one to load up. So yeah, we recently released a report at the end of September, which covered the experiences of Ukrainian arrivals in the UK. That was based on publicly available information, but it was also based on a survey of 191 Ukrainians that we conducted over a period of 3 weeks. So as you can see there, around 85% of our respondents were women, which makes sense given that most males in Ukraine are currently conducting military service. Importantly, most of our female respondents, so 72%, had a degree, and even some, 16%, had 2 university degrees. As regards immigration status, all of our Ukrainian arrivals had valid immigration status. Around 72% were on the Homes for Ukraine scheme, 16% were on the Ukraine family scheme, and the rest had some other form of leave to remain. You can see there that quite a large cohort of those respondents were from London, but we also had respondents from other parts of the UK. I think the worrying statistic that we drew out from that is of those who were from other parts of the UK, around 27% weren't able to identify who their local council is. It suggests we need to do a bit more work, I think, in the sector around outreach and ensuring Ukrainians have a point of contact to their local authorities. Next slide, please. I think there are 4 minute points as well in this section. So if we take a look at some of the key findings from our survey, eviction was a big issue affecting Ukrainians. As you can see there, around 1 in 10 were threatened with eviction at some point during their stay. This included 4% of Ukrainians who'd been threatened in the past and 6% who'd been sort of threatened by their current host or landlords. In terms of the national picture, the homelessness statistics have grown exponentially. So in September, there was a 22% increase in the number of homeless Ukrainian households. In October, this rose again by 13.57%. I think worryingly, the majority of those households do include children. We also don't know the full extent of the problem because the data collection around this is voluntary. So the latest stats from October, I think, suggest that around 20% of local authorities across the country are not yet reporting the extent of Ukrainian homelessness. So that point around data collection is quite important. One thing which we kind of uncovered and has been consistent through our work on Ukraine is the particular risks and vulnerabilities of those on the Ukraine family scheme. So you can see there some percentages around the risk of eviction. I think this starts to make sense once you realise that those arrivals and indeed those hosts that are part of the family scheme aren't being provided with the same amount of financial provision, and also the kind of safeguarding checks and points of contact with local authorities and with government departments is not the same as those who arrive under the Homes Ukraine scheme. We look there at the bottom around access to the private rental sector. And you can see there that a lot of people didn't have confidence in being able to independently find rental accommodation. I think that's reflective of the national picture that we're seeing right now. And just as these barriers that are mentioned there, such as high deposits and guarantors as well, are affecting Ukrainians, are affecting, I think, local communities as a whole. Next slide is 2 bullet points. So we also did some work around kind of financial circumstances of Ukrainian arrivals, and you can see there that a lot of respondents didn't have any savings, and those that did tended not to have more than 12 months on average. As well as this, 30% have found work in the UK, which is positive, and 55% are actively looking for work. Some of the barriers that were discussed there included the lack of English, flexible and part-time working opportunities being available for Ukrainians, a lack of recognition of educational and work-related certificates. And I think interestingly for us, there was explicit mention of rural and urban divides between different arrivals, and also childcare costs and issues that are affecting Ukrainians. So that was a report that was published at the end of September. Since then, we've been doing a follow-up piece of work, really focusing on the missing jigsaw piece, which we felt was the response of local authorities and their experiences, and how implementing Ukraine schemes has gone locally. So we've been working on that, in drafting the report on this with my colleague, and it's due to come out at the end of this month. We carried out semi-structured interviews with local authority teams, and this included people who had specific remits for the Ukraine schemes, kind of heading up the programs, as well as frontline staff and caseworking teams that were involved. I'll go into kind of more specific findings in a later slide, but the main takeaway is frustration. I think local authorities are being asked to do a lot without necessarily being empowered by central government to carry out kind of the full remit of what local authorities are able to. And just to give you kind of an idea of scope and how many local authorities this has covered. I mean, to date, the research has covered 12 different local authorities who currently have responsibility for nearly 5,000 Ukrainian arrivals under the Homes for Ukraine scheme alone. And that data is published, but we don't have the data for those authorities dealing with members on the family scheme and indeed on the extension scheme. So it's likely that the numbers are far greater than just 5,000. We can talk about some of the findings next. So these are a list of the main issues that came up in our interviews with local authorities. I'll touch on them briefly. One key issue which we didn't necessarily anticipate when we started the research was the expectations of Ukrainians. I think that local authorities relayed to us that the UK's housing situation and context wasn't necessarily communicated to the best that it could have been at the start of the schemes. So too many people have been left hopeful about the circumstances and the type of accommodation that they can get after their arrangements with hosts end. This is also having an impact on relocation out of areas. So many Ukrainians are finding it hard to accept offers for out of borough relocations. Many people have just started taking baby steps towards integrating into the UK. And I think there's a sense that they don't want to go through the additional trauma of having to move again and kind of reintegrate 6 to 8 months down the line. Housing stock, unsurprisingly, this was probably the biggest issue that virtually all local authorities mentioned. Many say they don't have affordable long-term housing solutions for Ukrainians or just generally. And the issue is not simply about housing stock either. It's also about the diversity of the stock to be able to deal with the size of families, but also families with specific needs. So, you might have elderly parents who are coming to the UK to join family members, or indeed, you might have some people who are disabled and have specific housing needs. Another kind of linked issue here was local housing allowance rates and the benefits cap. So many mentioned that housing benefits for most Ukrainians is not suitable to cover the cost of accommodation. Similarly, the benefits cap was having a negative impact in Ukrainians being able to access long-term housing. Local housing allowance rates specifically have been frozen since March 2020 and therefore have not sort of been in keeping with price rises, particularly since last year and kind of the post-COVID bounce in the rental market. Employment issues, I think local authorities were quite distressed at the fact that they had very qualified people, nurses, lawyers, teachers, and in one case, a nuclear physicist, would you believe it, who were not able to kind of access jobs that they were anywhere near qualified for, or rather they were overqualified for. And this is obviously having an impact on their ability to have a financial means to access the independent accommodation we've previously referred to. Local authorities confirmed the particular precarity of those arriving on the family scheme. I think for local authorities, the difficulty is that budgets are already stretched, and the Homes for Ukraine scheme funding for some local authorities, they are using it explicitly for Homes for Ukraine arrivals. Some authorities aren't, and they're trying to cater to everyone. But that's obviously kind of indicative of the negative side effects of having differences within the schemes, particularly around financial provision. New sponsors are proving hard to come by. So DLUC's policy for kind of post-hosting arrangements where breakdown has happened is that Ukrainian arrivals will find a new sponsor and be able to rematch, but new sponsors are not coming forward in the same amounts that they were when the Ukraine conflict started. And actually, the expressions of interest for sponsors, the percentage of those that are actually realisable and that are actually suitable is quite low. Local authorities are struggling with that. Local authorities talked about a lack of leadership. So some local authorities are taking the initiative and acting independently. Others are kind of waiting to see what's happening, waiting to see if there's a joint or cross-government kind of approach post 6 months. But this is obviously problematic because you have different, sometimes neighbouring authorities implementing different solutions, and that can be difficult for sponsors and guests who might know each other. And kind of bring up that dissonance. Guidance was another issue. I think local authorities felt the guidance, particularly post 6 months, was a bit woolly. So rematching isn't working to the same extent that perhaps DLUC had envisaged that it would. The guidance for Ukraine looked back that the private rental sector is effectively signposting to the rights and responsibilities of a tenant handbook, which does nothing to kind of mitigate the different barriers that they face in trying to access, particularly the private rental sector. And all of this is contributing to an increasing burden on local authorities. Finally, just 2 points there about financial commitments from government. So, you know, those local authorities that are taking initiatives locally post 6 months are finding it difficult to plan ahead, because I think that the current funding allocation, particularly for the Homes for Ukraine scheme, is for 12 months, so it covers up to March 2023. But there's been no word around what will happen after that. And I think, just speaking to Eva actually before we started, I think there's a piece that came out in Politico today suggesting that as part of tomorrow's budget, that Homes for Ukraine funding that local authorities receive could be slashed. So that picture might worsen. And the final point there was about a lack of overall strategy. So local authorities are understandably spinning a lot of plates. Everyone here will know about the recent migrant crossings that have taken place and kind of shifted the spotlight and media attention onto those arrivals. So there was a sense that the government's kind of differing approach to each of these relatively similar crises is unhelpful. And what we need is consistency and fairness amongst vulnerable communities as a whole. Just a final slide talking about recommendations. So we recommended a number of things as part of our initial report, which you can see there. Harmonising financial support across the schemes. That was in a bid to try and tackle the particular precarity that those in the family scheme are seeing. Revisiting the value of thank you payments and tariffs to local authorities. I know the former is actually being implemented by a lot of local authorities around the country, so that is a credit to them. Streamlining the reporting of homelessness to local authorities. I think Ukrainians would benefit from having kind of a simpler means of reporting the risk of homelessness before the day of eviction, and kind of making sure that local authorities have plenty of time to actually deal with those queries, rather than, in some cases, as our service provision team have seen, dealing with them on the very day of eviction. Consolidate referral and rematching across local authorities. I think local authorities are a bit sketchy around how rematching between boroughs is working, and also what impact that will necessarily have on financial provision. We've encouraged the creative use of funding. So, and again, some local authorities are doing this now, using the tariff to kind of put down deposits, pay for kind of upfront rent requirements on privately rented accommodation for Ukrainians. And we've also talked about the last point on the previous slide, which is developing this long-term strategy for refugee integration, kind of similar to the New Scots strategy in Scotland there. And just to talk about some of the things that local authorities raised most recently. So they're talking about harmonising financial support, raising local housing allowance rates, and lifting the benefits cap. Interestingly, some local authorities suggested that we should have a separate pathway for Ukrainian individuals who can support themselves, because though there are an increasing number of vulnerable Ukrainians in the UK, there is a minority who are able to support themselves either independently or with the assistance of kind of affluent and able sponsors. There's another point around data entry and collection, which we'll touch on more substantively when the report is released. But I think the coordination between the Home Office processing visas and local authorities carrying out checks and making sure that there's no kind of disparity in that process is really important, because we have seen some examples of safeguarding issues come up in that context. Leadership from DLUC. We are privy to and aware of many networks kind of taking place where best practice is being shared, and we strongly encourage that. But now, kind of in that post 6-month landscape, what local authorities are really needing is some direction from central governments. And the final bullet point there links to the point around long-term strategy. So I think local authorities who have been best prepared for the Ukraine crisis had already set up their own teams off the back of the Afghanistan crisis, off the back of dealing with the pandemic. And they were very quick off the mark to deal with some of the issues that Ukrainians were having when they arrived in the UK. Others who were slower didn't have that same kind of expedited response. So local authorities, I think, would benefit from some wider guidance around how they can deal with these crises in the future. And I think that is the last slide. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour of our research so far. As I said, the latest reports around local authorities is going to be released, I think, at the end of this month or the start of next month. And we'll be sharing that with colleagues in the sector and indeed DLUC, Home Office and parliamentarians. So I'll pass over to Eva.
Yeah, thank you, Addis, for that. That's brilliant. And I said that the work that Work Right Centre have been doing around this has been particularly valuable in making sure that we know what's going on the ground. And I'm really looking forward to the new report coming out to be able to see what else is happening a little bit further on down the line. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until after Eva's presentation, because I think Eva will probably speak to some of the issues which Addis has touched upon, but probably you have questions about. So let's see if we can get the next set of slides up on the screen. That'll be interesting. Okay. So,
oh, brilliant.
There we go. That, as if by magic, they suddenly appeared. I don't even know how we did that. So hopefully Eva can now give her presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Eva Barnsley and I work at London Councils as a policy officer leading on migration and asylum issues. So you will have seen my colleague Michelle on the previous panel. So at London Councils, we represent all London's 32 boroughs in the City of London, and we advocate on behalf of them, but also help bring them together to share best practice and so on. So thank you, Adis, for that presentation. We convene boroughs quite regularly to discuss a number of issues and challenges arising from the current refugee and migration situation we're facing. So that's across Afghan resettlement, support for Ukrainians coming over, and also support for asylum seekers and refugee challenges more widely. So Adis has actually presented to boroughs at one of those meetings that we coordinate regularly on Ukraine. So yes, I'm going to start by touching on housing challenges, and then I'm going to move on to talk a bit more about refugee homelessness before talking about Afghan evacuee resettlement, and then moving on to the Ukraine situation as well. But I won't go into too much detail on that, because I think, you know, the first presentation we've seen has really gone into all those key issues really. So yes, as you can see, we've got, I've highlighted here just some of the challenges around accessing the private rented sector in London. So as we've already discussed, local authorities, many local authorities do not have much housing stocks. There's a serious issue with a lack of social housing, and in cases, you know, where local authorities do, they also have huge waiting lists to access that housing. So basically, when we're talking about local authorities helping refugees and other arrivals via different schemes access accommodation, we're mainly talking about the private rented sector. And recently there was some research done by Savills that just highlights how challenging accessing the private rented sector is at the moment. I mean, most of us here might be renting in London. I know from a personal perspective, it's challenging enough finding a place to rent. But you can imagine for a lot of these people coming over who don't have savings and are reliant on benefits and so on, it's so much more challenging. So as you can see here, it says that there's been a sharp reduction in the supply of accommodation. So the number of properties available to rent across London have decreased by 35% since before the pandemic. So there's less property actually available to rent. And on top of that, as you can see here, the rents have increased by 16% just this last year, which is incredibly significant in such a short space of time. And on top of that, we've already spoken a bit about LHA rates. But we're seeing less and less properties available to rent at LHA rates. And we've also discussed issues of benefit cap, which serves as a significant obstacle to people being able to rent properties as well. But yes, as it says there, only 8.8% of all properties listed for rent were affordable on LHA rates for the first quarter of this year. Can we have the next slide, please? So I thought I'd start with that to lay some of the context behind all of this. But now I'm going to quickly move on to refugee homelessness. So again, I'm sure many of you will be aware of this, but in a normal situation, when you're an asylum seeker and you start having your asylum application processed, when you arrive, once you've gone through the border, you're placed in initial accommodation, and then from there, you're meant to be placed in what we call dispersed accommodation. So that's settled housing situation where you then wait to have your asylum claim processed. However, because of some of the challenges I've already gone into around accessing housing, we've seen increasingly asylum seekers being placed in hotels for significant periods of time while they wait for their asylum application to be processed because of the lack of affordable accommodation. So there are different providers that the Home Office use across the country to provide dispersed accommodation. And just to highlight as well, so for the asylum cohort, it's the responsibility of the Home Office to accommodate them and provide a Home Office allowance whilst they wait for their asylum claim to be processed. So they have contractors who get accommodation across the country. Within London, that contractor is Clear Springs. And so it's Clear Springs' responsibility for finding dispersed accommodation. But as I said, a lot of challenges with identifying affordable accommodation at the moment. So you've increasingly seen asylum seekers placed in hotels, and that presents a number of issues. You will have seen some of those issues in the media recently. Hotels, everyone accepts, government colleagues, local government colleagues, hotels are far from ideal. And particularly when you're seeing people waiting significant amounts of time for their asylum claims to be processed and ending up in hotels for a long period of time. So yes, we're seeing a lot of people in hotels, and normally you don't have your asylum claim processed while you're in a hotel. You'll then eventually get put in dispersed accommodation. However, we have heard of some reports recently where people have received a decision on their asylum application while they've been in a hotel, and then the next steps come into play. So asylum seekers, once they achieve refugee status, sorry, could we move on to the next slide, please? Once they achieve refugee status, have 28 days to then move on and secure their own accommodation. And refugees are able to access benefits. They're also entitled to support from local authorities if they need housing, so they can present as homeless. But I think an issue is a lot of refugees, as we've talked about earlier, aren't necessarily aware of all their rights and entitlements. And also they're meant to find their own accommodation, but a lot of the time, because they've been, in the asylum process and they haven't been able to work as they've been an asylum seeker, many of them don't have any savings whatsoever. And it's just not enough to suddenly have benefits and try and find accommodation. So you're seeing a lot of refugees presenting as homeless, even though they do have entitlements to benefits and so on, because they don't have savings. Also, if your asylum claim has been refused, as it says here, you have even less time to find move on support. However, there are situations by which you can continue to get support from the Home Office in accommodation, as it says there under Section 4 support. But I think it's a real challenge, the move on support for refugees. And I think that's compounded by the fact that they don't have the right to work. And it's also clearly impacted by the fact that it is just so hard to access affordable accommodation at the moment. And that's why we're seeing significant numbers of refugees presenting as homeless. So that's just to give a bit of an overview of refugee homelessness specifically. And yeah, moving on now to Afghan resettlement. So again, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the different types of Afghan resettlement schemes, but I just thought I'd clarify here. So there are two schemes for Afghan evacuees to be resettled into the UK, one being the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, and the other being the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Policy. Again, you can see online more of the details around that. I won't go into it today. But essentially, Afghan evacuees, we saw last year with the situation escalating in Afghanistan, a number of Afghan evacuees being flown over from Kabul in a very short space of time. And again, because of the sheer number of people coming over, they were placed in what we call Afghan bridging hotels. And with these resettlement schemes, it's a little bit different, obviously. It varies across different refugee support routes and so on. But if you come over from these two settlement schemes, you have access to benefits, you have the right to work, and you're also entitled to housing support from local authorities in the event that you do present as homeless. And also local authorities under these schemes are responsible for pledging support, pledging housing and wraparound support to help these individuals. So I mentioned that a number who were evacuated over were put in hotels in London and across the country. And I think the issue is many of them are still in hotels well over a year on since they've been evacuated, because local authorities are really struggling to find affordable accommodation to offer up to these individuals. And again, that's a great issue, because the longer we're not identifying accommodation for Afghan evacuees, and again, like I said, we're not able to rely on social housing. We are talking about finding accommodation from the private rented sector. The longer people are in hotels and not being able to move on with their lives. So it's a really great challenge. Local authorities have been working together to try and find ways to identify housing, and a number have been resettled into the community, but at the same time, it's not happening at a fast enough rate because of all these pressures I've explained around accessing the PRS. They do receive, once a family is resettled in housing, they do receive 20.5k per person to provide key wraparound support over the next 3 years. And again, we have seen some families starting to receive that support, but the issue is it's not happening fast enough because people are still in hotels. I think there's a number of issues. So the government have an enhanced matching approach, which is where essentially Afghan evacuees are matched to properties which local authorities bring forward. And there have been improvements made to that matching process. However, there have been some challenges around successfully matching these Afghan evacuees to properties. And obviously, because of the challenge around not enough housing coming forward, the government are thinking about, they have introduced this refusals policy. It's now got a different name. I can't remember exactly what they're calling it at the moment, but local authorities, when I speak to them, we refer to it as the refusals policy. And that basically means that if within a hotel, an Afghan family turned down 2 housing offers, then essentially they will have to have 56 days to find move-on support before they're evicted from that hotel. I think part of the issue is that some families have been given housing offers, but they've not necessarily been given much information around that offer or much time to actually consider whether they want to accept it, or it's in parts of the country that they know nothing about. And unfortunately, a lot of people do want to be placed in London, and London happens to have some of the highest pressures. So it's a really challenging situation. And I think local authorities are very worried that with this policy in place, we could see a number of Afghans being going through this refusal policy, and then essentially having 56 days to move on, not being able to find their own accommodation, and therefore presenting to the local authority as homeless. And so what we've seen is the different regions coming together to figure out a homelessness rota in the event that they do see a large number of homelessness presentations from Afghans, so that they can help distribute that pressure amongst local authorities. And they've worked in partnership with government colleagues to put together this rota. However, you know, it doesn't take away from the fact that they're frustrated that homelessness is being seen as a kind of solution in this case, when it's really not. You know, they regularly try to explain that putting people in temporary accommodation is far from ideal. It also is often not in the area that people expect it to be. So if someone presents in a local authority, they might expect to get housing there. In London, because of the lack of affordable properties available, most of the time it's not. They're actually placed somewhere far out of borough. So that's a massive challenge. So that's some of the issues facing Afghan evacuees in the homelessness space. And now moving on to the Ukraine visa schemes. I'm not going to go into detail about this because we've already discussed the different types of schemes and earlier in the presentation. So you've got the Homes for Ukraine scheme, the family visa route, and then the extension scheme. Probably worth just highlighting the point that's already been raised, which is that for all arrivals under Homes for Ukraine, local authorities receive funding, so that's 10.5k to support each arrival under Homes for Ukraine, and the family who host people under Homes for Ukraine also receive a £350 thank you payment. And with the family visa route, none of that funding is provided. And actually, even though we've got data on the number of family visas that have been issued, we don't have data on where those people who have family visas are then going. So local authorities aren't aware of how many people within their areas have arrived under the family visa scheme. And essentially, the only time they do find out is when those families reach out for support or present as homeless, which is what I'm about to go on to. So there's a significant difference between Homes for Ukraine scheme, the family visa route, and permission, the extension scheme with regards to the funding that's attached to it and local authority responsibilities. Can you move on? Thank you. So here's some data around homelessness presentations from Ukrainians. So this data is from DLUC, who have regularly put out a survey to local authorities on homelessness, but we've also cross-referenced it with a survey that we did at London Councils. However, I will flag that that survey was done in the summer. So again, some of the boroughs that have filled in our survey and haven't yet filled in the government survey may very well have had a higher number of homelessness presentations since we sent out the survey. Yeah, as it says here, London boroughs have accepted close to 700 homelessness applications from Ukrainian households since the 24th of February, which is clearly a very high number. And of this total, over 2/3 are families with children. Across the country, we're seeing that 30% of homelessness presentations are in London. And also, as it says here, you know, a number of those presentations are from Homes for Ukraine arrivals, and we're seeing an increase of presentations from the Homes for Ukraine scheme because we've reached the 6-month point of Homes for Ukraine, and sponsors are only technically asked to provide accommodation to these individuals for 6 months. But as it, you know, shows here, nearly 40% of presentations across the country are from family visa scheme arrivals. Again, that's linked to the issue that I raised before, where hosts, for if you've got family members coming over and you're hosting them in your property, you're not receiving any kind of thank you payment like under the Homes for Ukraine scheme for supporting those individuals, and local authorities aren't getting data on family scheme arrivals or money to support them. And then, yes, as it says here, I've already mentioned the 6-month point, but in light of a lot of these pressures, local authorities have been doing quite a lot to try and address this situation and to try and prevent homelessness. So it says a number are using the 10.5k tariff to top up Homes for Ukraine scheme thank you payments. So that means rather than giving, you know, £350, maybe once they've been hosting for over 6 months, they increase that to £500 or £600, for example, to try and incentivize people to stay on. They've also been talking to a lot of sponsor households about switching to a lodging arrangements that the Ukrainians that they're supporting can actually become lodgers. And a number of local authorities are also working with organisations such as Beam, which is a crowdfunding, which helps get crowdfunding support and also helps people into employment and accessing the PRS. And the 10.5k, as we've already discussed, can also be used to help with Ukrainians pay their first month rent or put down a deposit and other things like that. So local authorities are trying to be creative in addressing this issue. But clearly, as Ace went into in the presentation, there are a number of kiosks that we think would help support local authorities in this case. And I'm not going to go into these in detail again because they've already been covered, but just quickly, alignment between the schemes. So one of the big issues that continues to come up when we speak to local authorities is that there is no funding under the family visa scheme and no thank you payment to host under that scheme. Again, we need clarity on funding arrangements beyond the first year. Here it also says there were previous mentions of doubling the thank you payments. However, we haven't seen any kind of progress on that on a policy side of things. So I think doubling the thank you payment might help to incentivize more sponsors to stay on. And of course, local authorities are doing this in some cases themselves, but if you had that at national policy, that might help make more of a difference. And then there's also the point here about ESOL provision and recognising qualifications to help people into employment, because clearly accessing employment is a key way in which people can then go on to access accommodation. And then finally, at the end, I've just put innovative approaches to increasing housing supply for Ukrainians and the wider refugee cohort. So as I've said, there's a bit of a theme across all these cases, which is there isn't enough housing and there's not enough affordable housing. There have been really positive discussions that local authorities have had with people in the Home Office and DLUC around potential ways forward with this, for example, acquisitions programs and other approaches to try and increase housing supply. But we'd really advocate that we continue to progress with those kind of discussions and we actually do have proper solutions to help with this really challenging housing situation. And obviously we heard from ADIS as well, there are other things you can do, for example, around LHA rates, benefit cap increasing and things like that. So I think it's really important. I just want to emphasize that we need to see these issues in tandem with one another. We're in an incredibly challenging situation and all these issues for local authorities are very much linked. And a big theme across all these issues is homelessness and the risk of homelessness. So it's really important to focus on that on a whole. And I think it's been positive because local authorities have had really great discussions with a number of colleagues in the Home Office and DLUC around moving forward, but a lot of the time that's focused on individual schemes. When we have these discussions, we need to talk about support across the wider refugee and resettlement piece, so it's all interlinked and not kind of put off into those individual silos. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. So thank you to both our speakers, to Addison and Ava today, who's given us those wonderful presentations. Because of the technical problems at the beginning, we have got quite limited time for questions. And for those people asking in the room, I'm going to have to repeat your questions so that people online can hear them. So you're going to have to keep them short and simple because I can't manage otherwise. Okay. So I'll take a couple from people in the room and then we'll double check to see if there are any online. So I can see two hands. So there's one here and one here. So let this one first and then that one and then, yes.
Thank you. I think the microphone remains. Thank you so very much for these presentations. I think there was a type of one slide about the numbers in terms of visa files supplied and specifically verified. There's 39,000 family visa schemes and 120,000. I just want to make sure that we get the numbers right because that really makes a difference. In terms of the service we provide, for example, we are commissioned by Higher Council to support all Ukrainian arrivals. And as a frontline service, what the kind of resources we put in-house is that we recruited 3 Ukrainian civil service workers from the refugee cohort, and we are accompanied today by one of our wonderful caseworkers, her name is Yana, and she starts to deal with housing inquiries. So the first thing that I can get from this, and it's not short, I know, I'm not sure the presentations include the views of voluntary sector organizations. There's a lot of cultural knowledge. There's this in-depth understanding from engaging directly with these people. So I know that the survey around my work, for example, has captured some very specific information on housing. But to understand the complexity of these barriers, probably we need to speak to the voluntary sector organizations in more detail too. So that's just a suggestion.
Okay, so is that the end of the question?
I think that's.
Okay, so let me just repeat that for the people online and I'll come to the second question. So the first bit was about clarifying the different numbers of people coming through the different visa schemes, just so we're clear on that. And the second bit was the research that the Work Rights Centre's done has talked to individual Ukrainians, but you think that there might be work to be done from getting the views from the voluntary sector about what they're seeing and doing that as a piece of research as well to basically enrich the knowledge that's there. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm Yana, I'm from Process. Just a very quick question actually to Addis. It's not related to the presentation, so apologies, but what's the eligibility criteria for immigration advice and how would we access it? Would it be direct self-referral or would we refer people to you?
So you're talking about the Work Rights Centre specifically,
Yeah.
What's the criteria for them to provide immigration advice to people? So do you want to answer that one first, Addis, because that's quick, and then we'll go on to
Yeah, well, I think I can answer that one pretty quickly, which is just general signposting. We have so we recently hired a head of immigration who kind of oversees our casework. But if you were to refer the individual case, you might be referring to either to our service provision manager, to head of immigration, or indeed just through the online form that's on our website. Someone will get back to the client with some advice.
Okay.
Okay, and then the other questions, I don't know, you might want to start and we'll perhaps chip in on the second bit.
Yeah, I'll double check the data because it's actually published regularly on the government website. So it was just copied over from there. So I'll check if there was any mistake and yeah, get that back to Bethan. And then, yeah, on the point around, getting the views from the voluntary and community sector, I think that is incredibly important. And actually, when we're getting feedback from local authorities about pressures they're facing, so many local authorities are reliant on various voluntary and community sector organisations to carry out key support for Ukrainians, but also across the piece, including for those, refugee and asylum cohorts that they don't get funding specifically to support. So a lot of the time when we're talking about funding for local authorities as well, we're also talking about funding for the voluntary and community sector who are either commissioned directly from local authorities or local authorities just rely upon to get that support. So yeah, I think it's a really important point. Whenever we can, we do need to engage with BCS. And I work very closely at London Councils. We work very closely with the London Strategic Migration Partnership, which regularly convenes voluntary and community sector organisations to discuss the pressures they're facing. So yeah, really take that point.
I mean, my point is to encourage more diversity across the sponsor sector.
Yeah.
Those who are very connected to the councils or other communities. So we need to look at this grassroots organizations. The services are culturally informed and very much able to respond to the need, but they're also great resources. So I expect them to have some recommendations and solutions to address this crisis. Thank you.
So again, just to repeat that point for the people online, it was talking about increasing the diversity of the voluntary sector organisations who get a chance to put forward those views and to have their voices heard, because there are lots of grassroots organisations that may not be well connected to local authorities, but who have some very valuable insights to give. I think we might have time for just one more question. I can't see any online, so if we have one more question in the room, I'm happy to take it before we break. Anyone got another question yet? Okay.
Yeah, my question is just around what you mentioned in your presentation about people struggling to find employment despite being really well qualified, sometimes overqualified jobs. Is there any indication as to why that is? Is there an aspect of discrimination, or is it a lack of availability of the right jobs? I mean, I appreciate the sort of neuroscientist or whatever it was, specialist, people that have degrees and stuff. Is there an aspect of discrimination there?
Okay, so again, I'll repeat the question for people online, talking about barriers to employment and people not being able to access the kind of employment that they are properly qualified for. Is there an element of discrimination in the fact that they can't access that employment?
It's difficult, I think, to say, generally speaking. I think the difficulty is that for highly qualified professions, put Ukrainian arrivals to one side. If you want to qualify in this country as a doctor, but you have qualifications from another country, the process tends to be quite difficult. And so it's years long. We know that these schemes only provide people with a pathway for 3 years currently, and with no pathway to settlement yet. We hope there will be. So that's an issue. There's also an issue around English language. Eva mentioned provision of ESOL, which I would wholeheartedly support. But the Institute for Fiscal Studies recently released a report around inequality and immigration status. And one of the things they talk about is, you know, when migrant communities move to the UK, even if they are highly skilled or highly qualified, they end up having to downgrade jobs because of these sort of local competencies, including language, which they lack. So there are a number of different issues. I mean, I spoke earlier about rural and urban divides. Some of our respondents in the survey provided open text responses to say that there's not the infrastructure available for people who are sponsored in rural communities to access employment opportunities in urban centres. And even if they want to find kind of more menial employment locally, it just isn't available. So I think my sense is that it's not so much discrimination at this point, though I take the point that that might be the case in individual circumstances. It's more about some of these structural issues. I mean, one local authority actually mentioned to us that what they would kind of support, and I'm not sure if this has been done more widely. I think certain companies have kind of instituted these policies, but having kind of a partnership scheme with you know, big companies, Google, companies in the tech space to help and employ some of these highly qualified individuals. So we don't have to rely so much on local authorities to provide support, and we know that they're already stretched.
Thank you. Thank you, that's really helpful. So because we started a little late, we don't really have time to take any more questions, I'm afraid, at the moment. So you might just have to ask the speakers afterwards if you can catch them. An answer, or do you want to quickly give the answer?
Actually, to add that as a result, like approximately 80% of arrivals are Ukrainians, and there is also a problem women, mostly women, and the problem is that actually when they come to the UK, they start looking for a job, and the problem is that actually they are looking for their children. They have to take the children from school. Some go to nursery schools, and this is one of the problems that we face, and like I hear it like almost daily, like on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think childcare was picked upon in some of the presentations, but yes, when you have a large number of women who are probably coming without their partner and suddenly having to look after the children all themselves, then finding work is going to be a struggle, particularly with the cost of childcare. Absolutely, thank you. I just want to say, as we're wrapping up this session, we've talked quite a lot about resourcing, and I think there is a common thread along a lot of these issues, which is around what resources put into them. And we know that there are huge problems with resourcing a number of the different services that we're seeing. And I was at another event recently where someone said, oh, wait, they were talking about, I think, border control, saying, well, they're overwhelmed by the numbers. I was like, no, they are not. They are under-resourced for the need. And I think that's the same in local authorities and in Home Office. People are under-resourced for the actual need. And that's a political decision. And there are political decisions to be made about where we put our resources and how we help people. And I think that is going to be a key thread out today. And I think it is picked up there in some of the presentations we've seen today. So I do apologise that we have such limited time for questions. As I said, the technical problems took a little bit longer for us to resolve than I thought. We do now have a lunch session, so we have an hour for lunch, which will be back in the main room. And then after that, we have a second plenary before a series of afternoon workshop. So thank you. I hope it's been helpful. And thank you again to Adult and Agent for Yes.